Hello, my name is Arlindo Chagas, and welcome to the Noble Tales of Terror channel. If you love spine-chilling stories, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to never miss any terrifying tales. I had just started my night shift at St. Mary's Hospital. Being a nurse for over a decade, I was accustomed to the eerie silence of the night shift. But that night felt different. The air was thick with unease, and the hospital seemed unusually quiet. As I made my rounds, I passed by room 307, which was known among the staff for its strange occurrences. Patients often complained about whispers and cold drafts, but I always dismissed it as their imagination. That night, however, was different. As I approached the room, I heard a faint, almost inaudible whisper. My heart raced, but I tried to maintain my composure. I entered the room, expecting to find the patient asleep, but to my surprise, the bed was empty. Confused, I checked the patient log and confirmed that Mr. Thompson, an elderly man with severe pneumonia, was supposed to be in that bed. Panic started to set in as I searched the room, calling his name. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder and the temperature in the room plummeted. I turned around to see Mr. Thompson standing in the corner, staring at me with hollow eyes. "Nurse, help me," he croaked, his voice echoing unnaturally. Before I could react, he vanished into thin air, leaving me trembling with fear. I reported the incident to my supervisor, who assured me it was just my mind playing tricks on me due to exhaustion. Determined to finish my shift, I continued my rounds. Hours later, I heard the whispers again, this time coming from the ICU. As I walked towards the source, the lights flickered and the air grew colder. In the ICU, I saw a shadowy figure standing next to a patient's bed. The figure turned towards me, revealing a gaunt face with empty eye sockets. "You shouldn't be here," it hissed. Paralyzed with fear, I watched as the figure dissolved into the darkness. I rushed to the patient, who was in a deep coma, and checked his vitals. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I spent the rest of my shift on edge, jumping at every sound and shadow. When the morning finally came, I confided in a colleague who had been working at the hospital for years. She told me about the tragic fire that had occurred decades ago, claiming the lives of several patients and staff. According to legend, their spirits still haunted the hospital, especially during the night shift. I didn't want to believe it, but after that night, I couldn't deny what I had experienced. The whispers, the cold drafts, the apparitions, they were all too real. I never worked the night shift again, but the memories of that haunting night still linger. Some things are better left unexplained. Working as a nurse in a psychiatric hospital, I had grown accustomed to dealing with challenging patients and bizarre situations. However, nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in Ward C. The ward was reserved for the most severe cases, and the staff often joked about it being haunted. I always dismissed these stories as mere superstition until that fateful night. It was a quiet evening, and I was assigned to do the rounds in Ward C. As I walked through the dimly lit corridors, I felt a chill run down my spine. The atmosphere was heavy, and an unsettling silence hung in the air. I reached room 13, which had been unoccupied for years due to its notorious reputation. Patients who stayed there often spoke of a phantom patient who tormented them during the night. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check the room. As I entered, the temperature dropped drastically, and my breath became visible in the cold air. The room was empty, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Suddenly, I heard faint whispers coming from the corner of the room. I turned slowly, and to my horror, I saw the figure of a woman standing there, her eyes hollow and her face twisted in agony. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing in the small room. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure started to move towards me, her hands outstretched. Just as I thought I would pass out from fear, the door flew open and I stumbled out of the room. I ran down the corridor, my mind racing. I found my colleague Lisa and told her what had happened. She looked at me with a mix of fear and sympathy. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, still shaken. Lisa explained that the phantom patient was believed to be the spirit of a former nurse who had tragically taken her own life in room 13. She had been overwhelmed by the stress and the trauma of working in the psychiatric hospital. Since then, her spirit had been trapped in the room, reliving her pain and tormenting anyone who entered. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but after my experience, I had no choice but to accept it. I never entered room 13 again, and I eventually transferred to another hospital. The memory of that night still haunts me, a constant reminder of the unseen horrors that can lurk in the most unexpected places. It was my first week working at the old county hospital, a place with a dark history that the locals often spoke about in hushed tones. The hospital had been the site of numerous unexplained deaths, and many believed it was cursed. I was skeptical, attributing the stories to overactive imaginations. That was until I experienced the horror firsthand. One evening, I was assigned to the night shift in the pediatric ward. The ward was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights breaking the silence. As I made my rounds, I noticed a young girl, around 6 years old, standing at the end of the corridor. She wore a vintage nightgown and had an old-fashioned teddy bear clutched in her arms. "Hi there, sweetie. Are you lost?" I asked, approaching her slowly. She didn't respond, just stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. A chill ran down my spine as I reached out to touch her shoulder, but my hand passed right through her. She vanished into thin air, leaving me gasping in shock. I tried to rationalize what I had seen, convincing myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But as the night went on, more strange occurrences followed. Doors would open and close on their own, and I heard faint laughter echoing through the empty corridors. The worst part was the feeling of being watched, an oppressive presence that seemed to follow me wherever I went. At around 3 a.m. I was checking on the patients when I heard a blood-curdling scream coming from room 6. I rushed to the room and found the bed empty. The patient, a young boy who had been in a coma for weeks, was gone. Panicking, I searched the entire ward, but found no trace of him. Just as I was about to call for help, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the ward into darkness. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and turned to see the same young girl standing behind me. Her eyes were hollow, and her face twisted into a sinister grin. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. Frozen with fear, I watched as she slowly dissolved into the darkness. The lights flickered back on, and the boy was back in his bed, still in a coma. I stumbled out of the room, trembling. My colleagues found me moments later, and I told them everything. They exchanged knowing looks and told me about the hospital's cursed history. Decades ago, a fire had broken out in the pediatric ward, claiming the lives of several children and a nurse. Their spirits were said to haunt the hospital, seeking revenge for their untimely deaths. The young girl I had seen was believed to be one of the victims, and she appeared to warn or torment the living. I couldn't continue working there, and I resigned the next day. The experience left me traumatized, and even now I can't set foot in a hospital without feeling a sense of dread. Some places are marked by tragedy, and their dark history lingers, waiting to ensnare the unsuspecting. I'd been working as a nurse at Riverview General Hospital for several years, but nothing had prepared me for the events that unfolded one fateful night. It was a particularly busy evening in the surgical ward, and I was assigned to monitor a patient named Mr. Jenkins, who had undergone a complicated surgery earlier that day. Mr. Jenkins was an elderly man, frail and weak, but he had been stable since the operation. As the night progressed, I checked on him regularly, ensuring that his vitals were normal and his pain was managed. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. Mr. Jenkins' room was unusually cold, and a thick fog seemed to seep through the windows. I brushed it off as an odd weather phenomenon and continued my rounds. However, as I returned to Mr. Jenkins' room, I found his bed empty. Panic surged through me as I checked the bathroom and the hallway, but there was no sign of him. I alerted my colleagues, and we began a thorough search of the ward. Just as we were about to call security, a faint voice echoed through the corridors, calling my name. "Nurse! Nurse!" It was Mr. Jenkins. I followed the voice to an old, disused wing of the hospital, an area that had been closed off for years due to renovations that were never completed. The door to the abandoned wing creaked open, and I hesitated before stepping inside. The air was thick with dust, and the dim light cast eerie shadows on the walls. As I ventured further, the voice grew louder, leading me to a room at the end of the corridor. I pushed open the door and found Mr. Jenkins lying on a bed, surrounded by medical equipment from a bygone era. "Mr. Jenkins, what are you doing here?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked at me with hollow eyes and whispered, "I need your help. They won't let me leave." Before I could respond, the room filled with an intense cold, and shadowy figures began to emerge from the walls. These figures were nurses and patients, their faces contorted in pain and anguish. They reached out to me, their ghostly hands passing through my body, sending chills down my spine. I grabbed Mr. Jenkins' hand and tried to pull him out of the bed, but he was rooted to the spot. "You can't take him," a voice growled from behind me. I turned to see a tall, menacing figure dressed in a nurse's uniform from the 1950s. Her eyes were empty sockets, and her mouth twisted into a sinister smile. "He belongs here with us," she hissed. Terrified, I let go of Mr. Jenkins and backed away. The ghostly figures closed in on him, and he screamed in agony as they enveloped him in darkness. I ran out of the room, my heart pounding, and didn't stop until I reached the main ward. I tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed me. The next morning, Mr. Jenkins' body was found in his bed, lifeless. The official report stated that he had passed away in his sleep, but I knew the truth. The abandoned wing held a dark secret, and those who entered were never truly free. I left Riverview General shortly after, unable to shake the memories of that night. Some places are haunted by more than just memories. They are trapped in time, forever cursed. My name is Emily, and I've been a nurse for nearly a decade. During my career, I've encountered numerous strange occurrences, but none compare to what I experienced at Greenfield Hospital. The hospital was an old building, with parts of it dating back to the early 1900s. It was rumored to be haunted, but I never gave it much thought until I was assigned to the night shift in the East Wing. The East Wing was rarely used except during peak times when the hospital was overcrowded. That night, I was the only nurse on duty in the wing, with just a few patients to attend to. The corridors were long and dark, and the only sound was the occasional beep of a heart monitor. Around 2 a.m., I heard a faint crying sound coming from room 8. I walked down the dimly lit hallway and opened the door, but the room was empty. Confused, I checked the patient log and saw that room 8 had been unoccupied for months. Shaking off the eerie feeling, I returned to my rounds. A few minutes later, the crying started again, louder this time. I went back to room 8, and as I entered, the temperature dropped drastically. The lights flickered and I saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner. It was a young girl, no older than 8, wearing a hospital gown. Her eyes were wide with fear and tears streamed down her face. "Are you lost?" I asked gently, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond, just pointed to the corner of the room. I turned to look, and when I glanced back, she was gone. The room was empty, but the air was still thick with unease. Over the next few hours, I continued to hear strange noises, footsteps in empty corridors, whispers in the dark, and that haunting cry. I was on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder. At around 4 a.m., I decided to take a break in the staff lounge. As I sat down, the lights flickered, and the crying started again, this time right outside the door. I opened the door and saw the same young girl standing in the hallway. She looked at me with those haunting eyes and whispered, "Help me." I followed her as she led me to the old storage room at the end of the wing. The door creaked open, revealing dusty shelves and old medical equipment. In the corner of the room, I saw a small, child-sized bed covered in cobwebs. The girl pointed to the bed and whispered, "They took me away." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight and shone it around the room, but the girl had vanished. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and turned to see a figure dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform. Her face was pale and ghostly, her eyes hollow. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice echoing in the small room. Before I could react, she vanished, leaving me alone in the dark. I managed to open the door and ran back to the main ward, my heart racing. I tried to tell my colleagues what had happened, but they dismissed it as exhaustion and stress. However, I knew what I had seen. The East Wing was haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered and died there, their souls trapped in a place of pain and sorrow. I transferred to another hospital shortly after that night, unable to face the memories of what I had experienced. Some places are beyond saving, their history too dark to be erased. Greenfield Hospital was one of those places, and I will never forget the haunted cries of that lost little girl. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Until next time.